It was in freezing temperatures at dawn on Thursday, the 1st of February 1996, that cemetery staff, the procurator fiscal from Glasgow, the solicitor representing the McInnes family, environmental health officers, and 3 detectives watched on as 6 officers from the police support unit carried out a 5-hour task of exhuming the remains of John McInnes, who was buried in a family grave beneath his mother's remains, in the cemetery in the village of Stonehouse in Lanarkshire. John McInnes had grown up and lived in Stonehouse with his family, who were well off. John had briefly been in the Scots Guard before gaining employment as a salesman. John was a divorced man who, according to the Courier and Advertiser in January 1996, had belonged to a strict religious body called the Brethren. In 1980, at the age of 41, John McInnes had sadly taken his own life. So why, 16 years later, was his body being exhumed? Well, due to advances in forensic techniques, scientists had been checking evidence from unsolved murders, and in carrying out genetic fingerprinting on a member of John McInnes' family, a possible link between him and Helen Puttock, who had been murdered in 1969, was identified. It was then requested that John's remains be exhumed in order that DNA testing be carried out. The police believed at this point that they were very close to discovering who the killer had been that had had Glasgow gripped in a state of fear in the late 1960s. They believed John McInnes was the infamous Bible John. Glasgow, in the 1960s, was in decline. What had once been an affluent city was now in economic crisis. Houses and flats that had been built quickly to house the many workers that had descended on the city were now in disrepair, damp and dilapidated, and where being demolished was the only solution. Unemployment was high, and many now relied on welfare. Alcohol use and crime increased, and there was a general decline in health. With the residents of Glasgow having so much misery and despair in their lives, many were looking for a wee bit of fun, a wee reprieve from their daily hardships. And so getting all dressed up on a Thursday, Friday and Saturday nights and going out dancing the nights away at one of the many dance halls in Glasgow was just the tonic for many to forget about life for a while and just be with their friends or partners and have a good time. Some of the finest ballrooms in the world were said to be in Glasgow, with the Albert Ballroom on Bath Street, which opened in 1905, being Glasgow's first dance hall, which according to the Herald newspaper in 2013 soon became Scotland's first ballroom to hold dances 6 nights a week. However, the building was destroyed by a fire in 1974. More and more dance halls opened around Glasgow after that. There was the Locarno Ballroom in Sauchiehall Street in 1926, which was known as Glasgow's finest dance hall. There was the marvellous Majestic Ballroom, which opened in 1958 and enjoyed the status of being one of the city's most popular ballrooms, and a more upper-class clientele would attend here. However, this building was demolished in 1972. There was the Plaza, which opened in 1922 and had a huge dance hall and a huge fountain in the middle of it. And then there was the Barrowland Ballroom, which, according to barrowlandballroom.co.uk, opened in 1934 before being largely destroyed by fire in 1958. However, following a complete rebuild, it opened again on Christmas Eve 1960 and included a sprung dance floor, which many would enjoy spending their nights dancing away to the big bands that regularly played there. And on Thursday, the 22nd of February 1968, this was just what 25-year-old Patricia Docker planned to do. Patricia had married Alexander Docker in 1963, and the pair had moved to Lincolnshire in England, where Alexander was a corporal with the Royal Air Force. In 1964, a year after marrying, the pair welcomed their son Alex. However, by 1968, Patricia's marriage appeared to be on the rocks, as she had moved back to Glasgow with her son, who was now 4 years old, and was living with her parents in Langside Place, Langside, which is 4.3 miles or 7 kilometres south of Glasgow, and she had gained employment as an auxiliary nurse at Mearns Kirk Hospital in Newton Mearns, which was located about 5.3 miles or 8.5 kilometres southwest of where she was living with her parents. As a single parent, Patricia worked long hours at the hospital before coming home and looking after her son. However, she was only 25 years old and was still looking to have some fun in her life. and so her parents would look after her son Alex on occasion so that Patricia could go out and enjoy herself, which is what she planned to do on Thursday the 22nd of February 1968, and had told her parents that she would be heading to the Majestic Ballroom that evening, the ballroom that Patricia would regularly attend on her nights out. Patricia had put on her best clothes for her night out dancing that evening, wearing a grey duffel coat with a blue fur collar and a yellow knitted dress. She then said bye to her young son Alex and her parents before leaving her home and going out into the bitterly cold night, no doubt glad that she'd wrapped up warmly. Patricia's naked, beaten up and strangled body was found in a lane beside a garage lockup only a few hundred yards or metres from her parents' home on early Friday morning by a man walking to his car to go to work. Police and detectives soon descended on the horrific scene, and the initial police officers on the scene did a great job at trying to preserve the crime scene by documenting what they saw and any potential evidence and not allowing anyone near the crime scene, despite sadly there being little useful forensic evidence to note. Upon more detectives, police officers, and eventually the lead detective arriving on the crime scene though, the scene began to become contaminated, especially as the lead detective on the case told officers and other detectives to go and look at the body so it was ingrained in their minds and that they knew just what they were dealing with. I imagine the lead detective likely didn't set out to deliberately contaminate the crime scene by allowing this, and it's been suggested that he was likely trying to fire up his detectives and PCs who would be working on the case so they worked harder to find Patricia's killer, but due to this, the crime scene was contaminated. Door-to-door inquiries were then ordered to be carried out by some officers. From the door-to-door inquiries, it was established that a witness had heard a woman scream, "Leave me alone," and that several cars had been seen in the area at the time of the murder, leading detectives to question whether Helen's killer had potentially driven her home. However, despite appeals being made for these car owners to come forward, nobody ever did. The detectives also spoke to Patricia's parents, who incredibly hadn't found out that the young woman's body found only a few hundred yards from their home was their daughter Patricia, instead assuming that she was staying at a friend's. That was until they read about the murder and the young lady's description in the evening newspaper, at which point they approached the police, saying they believed the body found was their daughter Patricia, which was confirmed shortly afterwards upon Patricia's father, John Wilson, identifying the body as being Patricia. Patricia's parents were absolutely distraught, but they were able to tell detectives that Patricia had left home the previous evening to catch a bus into Glasgow and had told them she was heading to the Majestic Ballroom, which was located in Hope Street, a 7-minute walk northwest of Glasgow city centre. Armed with this information, the head of Glasgow's CID, Detective Chief Superintendent Goodall, made an appeal to those who were at the Majestic Ballroom on Thursday night to contact the police. He went on to say that the names and addresses of anyone who came forward would be strictly confidential. The detective also made an appeal to try and find the clothing Patricia had been wearing that evening, as all of her clothing and her bag had been removed from the scene. It was believed that Patricia's killer may have thrown her clothes away. Taxi drivers who had dropped anyone near the lane where Patricia's body had been found between 10:30 p.m. and 1:15 a.m. were also asked to contact the police. While the police were waiting for people to come forward, officers attended the Majestic Ballroom and interviewed about 150 dancers in their hunt for Patricia's killer, with only one man saying that he recognised Patricia and that he'd seen her dancing at the Majestic Ballroom on the Thursday evening. However, he was unable to remember anything about who she may have been in the company of. And so the detectives continued to focus most of their investigation into attending the Majestic Ballroom and trying to find further witnesses there. However, the investigation into Patricia's murder soon took a disappointing turn. A few days after Patricia's body had been found, and with no other leads to go on, the police again interviewed the man at the Majestic Ballroom who had said he had seen Patricia on the Thursday evening. This was when the police found out that their investigation had been focused on completely the wrong place. as under questioning, the man admitted that while he had seen Patricia, he hadn't actually seen her on that particular Thursday evening. In fact, it was soon discovered that Patricia had likely not attended the Majestic Ballroom on Thursday evening like she had told her parents she was going to, but instead had attended the Barrowland Ballroom, which was a 17-minute walk southeast of Glasgow city centre and in completely the opposite direction to where the Majestic Ballroom was. So, what reason would Patricia have had to tell her parents she was going to the Majestic Ballroom, where she regularly would go, but instead go to the Barrowland Ballroom? Well, Thursday nights at the Barrowland Ballroom was for over 25s, where commonly males and females could go if they were looking to pick up a sexual partner for the night. Not everyone, of course, many just went to enjoy the dancing, but the Barrowland Ballroom had a reputation that on Thursday evenings it was where married men and women would remove their wedding rings for the evening to pretend they were single, and this was common knowledge. One theory was that Patricia had not told her parents where she really intended to go that evening, as they likely wouldn't approve. Patricia was still married after all, and the Majestic Ballroom had a much better reputation and where a more upper-class clientele would go, and so she had likely told this white lie. However, this white lie, as well as the wrong statement by the man at the Majestic Ballroom who claimed to have seen Patricia there on the fateful Thursday night, had seriously impacted the investigation into her murder, as the police had been focused on the wrong ballroom and in asking the wrong dancers for information. It also appeared that the police were not following up on any other lines of inquiry, but instead had put all of their resources into finding witnesses at the Majestic Ballroom. And so when it was established that they had been focused on the entirely wrong ballroom, the detectives found themselves with no other areas or lines of inquiry to investigate. The first 48 hours of any crime is vital, and the detectives hunting Patricia's murderer had lost days before finally focusing on the correct ballroom and dancers. Whether due to the delay in questioning the correct dancers, or whether people were just not coming forward as they didn't want a significant other to know they were at the Barrowland Ballroom on that Thursday evening due to its reputation, despite the police saying their names would be kept confidential, detectives found very few people who could remember seeing Patricia Docker at the Barrowland Ballroom that evening. And once she had walked out of the Barrowland Ballroom doors for the evening, not one person could be found who had seen her again, leaving the police with very little to work with. The post-mortem of Patricia's body confirmed that the cause of death had been strangulation, with the marks on her neck suggesting that she had perhaps been strangled with a belt, possibly the killer's, as Patricia had not been wearing a belt. Patricia's body also displayed evidence that she had been severely beaten, with her face and head appearing to have received the most violence. While there are some reports that say Patricia was also raped, in the book The Lost British Serial Killer by David Wilson and Paul Harrison, it states that Professor Gilbert Forbes, who conducted the post-mortem, said that there was no clear evidence of sexual assault, and that Patricia had been menstruating at the time of her death. And strangely, the only thing of note that had been found at the crime scene was Patricia's sanitary towel, which had been placed at the side of her body, which led to one theory at the time being that Patricia had met a man at the Barrowland Ballroom who had escorted her home, but that this man had plans to have sex with Patricia and had been incensed to find out that she was menstruating, and so had killed her. 11 days after Patricia had been brutally murdered, the police were no further forward. They had no witnesses, no evidence, they didn't even have Patricia's clothing or handbag, although her handbag and the casing of her watch was eventually found in the nearby river Cart, following police divers searching it in a bid to trace Patricia's missing items. But again, nothing could be gleaned from this discovery, and Patricia's clothes were never found. And so, when 3 other murders took place in another part of the city, officers were removed from Patricia's murder investigation and the case, and after months of work, the case went cold. The residents of Glasgow, other than Patricia's heartbroken and devastated family, carried on with their daily lives, carried on attending the great ballrooms and dancing the nights away, as dancing was such a massive part of the lives of many in Glasgow at that time, and Patricia's murder gradually began to fade from their minds, many hoping that Patricia's murder had been a one-off and that her killer would soon be caught. But he wasn't. and it also wasn't a one-off. As Margaret O'Brien made her way to the derelict building that was 23 Macheath Street in Bridgeton, she grew more and more concerned of what she would find there. Having heard mutterings from the local children about there being a body in the building, Margaret had just assumed that it was a drunk that had fallen asleep. However, as it was now 2 days since she had last seen her sister Jemima, Margaret decided to check the story out. Entering the derelict building, she approached the body she saw lying in a bed recess, held her breath, and bent down to find out who was lying there, clearly dead. It was Saturday the 16th of August 1969, 18 months after the brutal murder of Patricia Docker, and 32-year-old Jemima McDonald was getting ready for a night out in Glasgow. Jemima lived in a tenement flat at Macheath Street in the Bridgeton area of Glasgow, located about 2.2 miles or 3.5 kilometres southeast of Glasgow city centre. She lived with her 3 children, 12-year-old Elizabeth, 9-year-old Andrew, and 7-year-old Alan. The children's father was not in the picture, but Jemima's sister, Margaret O'Brien, lived in the flat right across the hall from Jemima with her husband. The sisters worked hard during the week, and so on a weekend, the pair would regularly head out, where they would attend ballrooms to dance, catch up with their friends, and have a bit of fun. However, on Saturday the 16th of August, Margaret and her husband had had a row and she wasn't going out with Jemima that night, which was disappointing for the pair, but Margaret would instead look after Jemima's 3 children while she went out and enjoyed herself. And so, after getting dressed in her best dancing clothes of a black dress and white frilly blouse, Jemima, who was also known as Mima, headed to her favourite venue, the Barrowland Ballroom, for a night of dancing. When Jemima hadn't made it back home by the following morning, Margaret wasn't initially concerned, thinking Jemima had maybe stayed at a friend's house for the night. And so when she began to hear murmurings that the local children had discovered a body in the derelict building nearby, she didn't think anything of it, assuming someone had just had a bit too much to drink the night before and was sleeping it off. However, when Jemima still wasn't back home by Monday, Margaret was now really concerned. And so with great trepidation, she made her way to the derelict building, which was only 20 yards or metres from her own home. And sadly, this is where Margaret found the beaten, raped and strangled body of her beloved sister Jemima. Absolutely distraught and filled with disbelief, Margaret and Jemima's 3 children watched on as police and detectives descended on the crime scene in the hopes of finding a clue to who may have killed Jemima McDonald. However, sadly, as a number of children and adults had been in and out of the building and near Jemima's body before the police were called, the crime scene was contaminated. In fact, it was reported that Jemima's body had even been moved, possibly by her sister and others who had been trying to help Jemima, despite Jemima sadly already being dead. Now, at this point, no links had been made between Jemima's murder and the murder of Patricia Docker some 18 months previously. While Patricia's body had been found naked and all of her clothes removed from the scene, Jemima had been fully clothed, but her clothing had been torn. And while there was evidence that Jemima had been raped, with Patricia, the post-mortem had stated that there was no clear evidence of this. However, there were certain glaring similarities, such as both women's handbags were missing, both had been at the Barrowland Ballroom the previous evening, both had been beaten, both had been strangled, although it was not known exactly what Patricia had been strangled with, only that a belt was suspected. However, Jemima had been strangled with her own stockings. Another similarity which was discovered upon the post-mortem being carried out on Jemima's body was that she'd been menstruating at the time of her death, exactly the same as with Patricia, and also that Jemima's sanitary towel had been found next to her body, same as with Patricia. Coincidence? Also heading up the investigation into Jemima McDonald's murder was the same man who had been the lead on the investigation into Patricia Docker's murder 18 months earlier, Detective Chief Superintendent Tom Goodall. Again, door-to-door inquiries were carried out to see if anyone had seen or heard anything, which gleaned very little, other than a witness who had heard female screams on the evening of the murder. And so again, police and detectives turned to the dancers who attended the Barrowland Ballroom to provide them with any information, again reiterating that the details of anybody who came forward would be kept confidential, due to the reputation of the Barrowland Ballroom and many of the men and women who attended there on mainly Thursday and Saturday nights. And while this tactic had failed to produce any witnesses in the case of Patricia Docker's murder, this time there was an abundance of witnesses who testified to seeing Jemima at the Barrowland Ballroom on the Saturday evening. And even better, many eyewitnesses were able to describe a male that had not only been in Jemima's company that evening, but who she had also been seen leaving with. It was reported that Jemima had been seen in the company of a young, well-dressed, well-spoken, and slim man with reddish fair hair, cut short, aged between 25 and 35, about 6 foot in height, wearing a suit and white shirt, and that Jemima had been seen leaving the Barrowland Ballroom with the same man around midnight, where she began the 16-minute walk home, as according to the book The Lost British Serial Killer by David Wilson and Paul Harrison, Jemima was seen again with this man walking along London Road, yards from where she would turn off to access the short walk left to her flat in Macheath Street. With the police feeling confident that they were closing in on Jemima's killer, having received such a great response from the public and such a great description of the man Jemima had been seen with, they were keen to keep the momentum up. And so 2 witnesses, a male and a female, who were able to give the most detail about this man, were asked to help make an identikit picture of this man. The police enlisted the help of Deputy Director Lennox Patterson from the Glasgow School of Art, and after working with the 2 eyewitnesses, Lennox was able to produce a drawing, which, after receiving permission from the Crown Office in Edinburgh to release this picture to the media, as according to the book The Lost British Serial Killer, at that time, Scottish law prohibited the publication of photographs or pictures of suspects ahead of arrest or trial, was circulated in newspapers and on television, with the plea from police being, "Find this man." Due to this law, this was actually the first time in a Scottish murder investigation that an artist's impression of a suspected killer had been used in newspapers in Scotland. With the release of the identikit picture, and from the reconstruction that took place of a police officer retracing the route Jemima would have taken on that fateful Saturday night, the police received many new leads to investigate. However, all of which eventually turned up nothing. Undercover police also attended the Barrowland Ballroom night after night, week after week, in the hopes of spotting the man in the identikit. However, again, this proved fruitless, and the investigation was wound down. The case grew cold, and the once massive police presence at the Barrowland Ballroom was no more. But as long as this killer was out there, it left many women concerned for their safety, especially with the police stating that until this man was caught, he could strike again. And so females tended to go to the ballrooms in large groups and refrained from going home alone with any men. So who was this man? Was he just passing through the area and decided to visit one of the ballrooms before leaving the area again? Or was he a local man, maybe a regular attender at the ballrooms, and just was laying low until the police activity died down? But if he was a local man, then surely somebody should recognise him. As Jemima's murder had at this stage not yet been linked to Patricia's murder, many hoped that this was just a one-off killing. Surely there wouldn't be any more murders. Would there? Well, it wouldn't be long before the residents of Glasgow had their answer. Helen and George Puttock had married in Reading in England not long after the pair met in 1962. Helen was from Glasgow, but upon meeting and marrying George, who was in the army, Helen moved with George to Germany, where George had been stationed with the army. A couple of years into their marriage, the pair welcomed their first child, David, and 3.5 years later, Michael came along. While the pair had a fantastic marriage and 2 happy and healthy boys, Helen was finding it difficult living in Germany. She didn't speak much German, and while she'd had a very active social life back in Scotland, she was feeling very isolated in Germany. And so, not wanting his wife to be so unhappy, George made the suggestion that Helen and their 2 young sons should go and live in Glasgow, where they would be at least near family and Helen's friends. And so Helen and her 2 young sons moved back to Glasgow and stayed with Helen's mum, who lived in Errol Street in the Scotstoun area of Glasgow, which is about 4.6 miles or 7.4 kilometres west of Glasgow city centre. Helen's sister Jean, who was known as Jeanie, also lived in nearby Knightswood with her 3 children, but her husband and her were estranged. Helen, who was 29 years old, loved being back in Glasgow again, close to her family, and able to see her friends again. And she began going out dancing with her sister, Jeanie, and her friends, which they loved. A week after Helen moved back to Glasgow, her husband George also arrived in Glasgow as he was on leave from the army, and he too stayed at Helen's mum's. While Helen loved her husband and was pleased he was in Glasgow on leave, it was Thursday the 30th of October, and Helen wanted to go out dancing with her sister. George wasn't particularly pleased about the thought of Helen being out dancing with other men, but Helen's mum told him that it was okay, it didn't mean anything, all the girls just went out dancing because they enjoyed it, and that there was absolutely nothing to worry about. And so George relented and said he'd stay home and look after their 2 sons, David, now 5, and Michael, now 18 months. Although George insisted that the 2 sisters got a taxi back home as he didn't want them travelling on public transport late at night, and he gave them money for the taxi fare. And so Helen and Jeanie got their best dancing clothes on, which for Helen was a short black dress with short sleeves, black shoes, and an imitation fur coat, before saying bye to their mum and George, leaving the house and heading to meet with 2 of their friends in a Glasgow pub, where the foursome caught up and had a good amount to drink, before Jeanie and Helen headed to the Barrowland ballroom to end their evening dancing. It wasn't long before Jeanie was asked to dance by a polite man who said his name was John and that he lived in Castlemilk, which was an area of Glasgow that was about 7.2 miles and 11.5 kilometres south of Glasgow city centre. Although, as this was Thursday night at the Barrowland Ballroom, which was popular with over 25s who tended to be married and possibly looking for extramarital sex, most men tended to call themselves John and made up stories about themselves to avoid their spouses ever finding out what they had been up to. But Jeanie didn't mind. Neither she or Helen were looking to hook up that evening. They were just there to dance and have fun, which Jeanie was currently doing with her dance partner. As Jeanie was whirled around the floor by her excellent dance partner John, she noticed that a man was looking at her sister Helen, before he then approached her and asked her to dance. However, Jeanie quickly noticed that her sister's dance partner didn't appear to be anywhere near as good a dancer as her partner, and he also didn't look much like the other men at the dance hall who were standing around the edges of the room or swinging a partner around the dance floor. No, Helen's dance partner was very smart looking, wearing a brown suit and tie and wore his hair very short and neatly cut, something that was very uncommon in the Barrowland ballroom, where most men's haircuts were long. Jeanie thought, as she watched the man dancing with her sister, that he stood out like a sore thumb. As the band's current song came to an end, the foursome made their way to a table to sit down, where Jeanie found out that Helen's dance partner was also called John, and her and Helen shared a knowing smile. Throughout their time together, Jeanie's earlier thoughts about Helen's dance partner being a bit different to the normal crowd that frequented the Barrowland ballroom were affirmed, as every time Helen would stand up or would come back from the toilet, her dance partner always stood up until she'd sat down again, which was something that definitely wasn't commonplace at the Barrowland ballroom. This man was very different. But Jeanie had no idea just how different this man really was. As the night came to an end, the foursome made their way to the entrance, where Jeanie stopped at the cigarette machine to purchase some cigarettes before heading home. However, upon placing her money in the machine, no cigarettes came out. This is when she had another chance to observe Helen's partner's reactions, as react he did. He was furious on Jeanie's behalf, and demanding of the bouncers there that he speak to the manager, who he also had an interaction with. What Jeanie found interesting, though, was that this man called John remained completely in control of his temper. He didn't shout or swear, despite being clearly incensed by the fact the manager was not immediately either giving Jeanie her money back or giving her a packet of cigarettes. Jeanie believed she was looking at a man who was very used to getting what he wanted. but it was very disconcerting watching this man remain so under control, especially as the manager had gotten angry and was most definitely not in control of his emotions, which was only made worse when John said to the manager that places like the Barrowland Ballroom were dens of iniquity. This again cemented in Jeannie's head that this man was very unlike many who attended the Barrowland Ballroom. It was just after the interaction between Helen's dance partner John and the manager when John produced something from his pocket and showed it to Helen, who in turn seemed a bit surprised but impressed. However, when Jeannie inquired what it was, John basically told her to mind her own business. Some have speculated that this may have been a photograph of this man in the army, perhaps even being part of Helen's husband's regiment, while others think it may have been a police warrant card. The small group then left the Barrowland Ballroom and began walking to a taxi rank. It was at this point that Jeannie's dance partner, Castle Milk John, said that he was going to catch the late-night bus to the south of the city before disappearing into the night, leaving Jeannie, Helen, and John to get a taxi together. As Jeannie lived the furthest away in Knightswood, she assumed that she would be the last person to be dropped off. However, she soon found out that John had other ideas, and he quickly suggested they drop Jeannie off first and he would see Helen home, saying that he didn't want Jeannie left in the taxi by herself. With this agreed, the three sat back in the taxi for the approximately 18-minute taxi ride to Jeannie's home. Upon the taxi pulling up outside Jeannie's home, she bid her sister and John a farewell and closed the taxi door, expecting her sister to be home shortly, with her only living a 6-minute drive away, and not realising for 1 second that it would be the last time she would ever see her sister alive, and that she would soon have to rack her drink-infused brain in order to recall every last detail about her evening in the company of John. The following morning, George Puttock woke up to find his wife Helen was not in bed beside him. Thinking maybe she'd stayed at her sister's, George got up, opened the curtains of his bedroom and looked out to see a police van in the street. Speaking on the BBC documentary The Hunt for Bible John, George Puttock said, "Don't ask me why, but I knew then that something was wrong." He said he immediately went to the police van and spoke to the officer there, hearing in hushed voices on the way that apparently a girl had been murdered. The detective in charge, Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie, came to speak to George and asked him what his wife had been wearing, to which Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie then told George that it was his wife that had been murdered. Helen Puttock's body had been found at 7:25 a.m. that morning on disused land about 100 yards or meters behind her flat on Errol Street. She had been raped, severely beaten, bitten and strangled with one of her stockings. It was also discovered that Helen had grass stains on her feet, which indicated to detectives that she had tried to run away from her attacker, with Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie guessing, according to the Lost British Serial Killer book, that her attacker had caught Helen, then punched her repeatedly about the face and head before dragging her back across the grass, turning her over and restraining her so he could remove one of her stockings and strangle her. It was reported that her face had been so badly beaten that the man who had found her body when out walking his dog, despite living in the same street as Helen and likely knowing her, didn't even recognise her. It was also discovered that Helen had been menstruating at the time of her murder, and in fact her sanitary towel had been placed neatly under her armpit. While Helen's clothes had been present, albeit they had been ripped and were in disarray, Helen's bag was missing, although the contents of it were scattered nearby. Helen also had a deep bite mark on her body, with some reports saying it was on her leg, while others say it was on her wrist. Wherever it was clear that the violence directed towards Helen was severe. Following closer examination, semen and a single hair was found in Helen's stockings. However, as DNA profiling was unknown back then, this evidence was logged and stored, in the hope that one day it might just hold the key to who Helen's killer was. according to an article in Sky News on the 23rd of February 2018 by Joe Jackson, who was a young detective who worked on the Patricia Docker and Helen Puttock murder inquiry, said that it wasn't until Helen Puttock's murder that finally a link between the murders of Patricia Docker, Jemima McDonald, and Helen Puttock was finally officially mentioned, with the most obvious link being that all three women had been at the Barrowland Ballroom the night before they were murdered, and that apparently it wouldn't be until this link was established that the inquiry into a potential serial killer really took off, with the murder inquiry of the three women being led by Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie, who was determined to catch this man before he struck again. Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie's first job was to rule out Helen's husband as being involved in her murder, and he did this by asking George to remove his clothing so he could check his body for any marks, as he believed after seeing the crime scene that Helen had put up a fight and no doubt would have caused some injuries to her attacker. Following this, the detective was satisfied that George was not Helen's murderer, and so Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie then turned his attention to Helen's sister, Jeannie, who he quickly found out had been on a night out the previous evening with Helen and had amazingly accompanied Helen and John, the last person so far to have seen Helen alive, in a taxi home after attending the Barrowland Ballroom. What Jeannie said to the detective would not only give a name and face to the presumed serial killer, but it would also take Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie down a single-minded path that not everyone agreed with. Helen's sister Jeannie was distraught and shocked by what had happened to her sister, presumably by the man they had both been in the taxi with that evening, and she was determined she would do anything she could to find her sister's killer. Jeannie first recounted the sisters' evening together, meeting with friends for a few drinks at a pub before attending the Barrowland Ballroom with Helen to dance the night away. Jeannie told how she had danced with a man called John, who said he was a slater from Castlemilk, and that her sister Helen had been dancing with another man, also apparently called John, who had said that his surname had either been Templeton or Sempleson, but Jeannie couldn't remember which. Jeannie described the man her sister danced with as being aged between 25 and 30, being tall, approximately 5 foot 10 inches, or about 1.78 meters, being slim, well-dressed and well-spoken, with reddish or fair hair that was rounded neatly at the back, and that he had overlapping front teeth and a tooth missing at the back. She also said that he did not dress or act like the usual dancers at the Barrowland Ballroom. Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie was feeling very confident that Helen's killer would be brought to justice swiftly, due to the detailed description that Jeannie had been able to give him of the last man to have seen Helen alive. However, Jeannie had more to say about the suspect that the detective felt could help the investigation even further. Jeannie said that following Helen, herself, and the two Johns leaving the Barrowland Ballroom, she said that John from Castlemilk left to apparently catch a late bus home, while the trio hailed a taxi to take them home. Jeannie then told of what had taken place in the taxi ride before Jeannie had been dropped off at her home. She said that John had initially been quiet on the journey in the taxi, but had eventually started to open up, telling the sisters that he didn't drink alcohol at Christmas or Hogmanay, which is Scotland's New Year's Eve, and instead he would read the Bible and pray. He went on to say that he didn't drink alcohol due to his strict upbringing. He also apparently said that his father called dance halls dens of iniquity, and that he himself had strong feelings about married women with children who attended ballrooms, saying they shouldn't be in such places, repeating that dance halls were adulterous dens of iniquity, as well as quoting the Old Testament stories of Moses. Jeannie also told the detective that John had said he had worked in a laboratory, and also that he had seemed familiar with the public transport around Glasgow and their costs. Jeannie also told the detective about the incident with the cigarette machine before the four had left the Barrowland Ballroom, where John had become angry, before saying to the manager that places like this were just dens of iniquity, going on to say that John also had a packet of Embassy cigarettes on him as he had offered Helen one, although Jeannie hadn't seen him smoke all evening. Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie was thrilled that Jeanie was not only able to give a great description of the last man to have seen Helen alive, but also she had given the detectives numerous lines of inquiry. The only thing left to do was have an artist's impression drawn using Jeanie's description. But this was hastened when Jeanie said that the photo fit that had been drawn by Lennox Patterson from the Glasgow School of Art following the murder of Jemima McDonald was very much like the John that had last been seen with Helen. Immediately, the police sought the help of Lennox Patterson again to bring Jeanie's account of the suspect to life. And within a few days, Lennox had produced a colour painting of this man, which upon Jeanie seeing, she agreed that it was an excellent likeness and that it should definitely get Helen's killer caught. And so, this painting was released to the newspapers and TV to be circulated. But a name for this potential serial killer was now needed, which came following a press conference when Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie mentioned about the fact this man had appeared religious and had quoted the Bible on numerous occasions throughout the night, which is when the name Bible John was coined. Not only did this killer have a face, he had a name too. Now all that was left to do was find him. While detectives waited for information to come in from the public about who this man could be, they carried on with their investigation. Going by the description of the suspect in Helen's murder from her sister Jeanie, the police first visited all of the dentists around Glasgow to show them the newly made-up picture of Bible John, and to see if any of them could point the police in the direction of a patient who had overlapping front teeth and a missing back tooth, of which a plaster representation was produced. But sadly, after dentists had examined their records, this lead led nowhere. Not to worry, there were other lines of inquiry, such as what the suspect had been wearing, a smart brown suit. And so all of the 240 tailors in the Glasgow area were visited and shown the picture of Bible John to see if they recognised either him or the suit that was described. But no, this line of inquiry went nowhere either. However, another line of inquiry was the fact that the suspect's hair had been unfashionably short, and so police visited the 453 hairdressers and barbers that were located in the Glasgow area, again armed with a picture of Bible John to see if anyone recognised this man as one of their customers. Again, though, this line of inquiry proved fruitless. As Bible John had quoted from the Bible, every church in Glasgow and Sunday services were also visited looking for the suspect. But again, no results came from this. However, it was thought that perhaps Bible John had been in the armed forces due to his short haircut, and so copies of the Bible John picture were sent to the British Army, the RAF, and naval bases at home and abroad to see if this man could be recognised. And despite detectives, and on one occasion Helen's sister Jeanie, visiting bases up and down the United Kingdom to try and identify possible suspects and interview others, again, this line of inquiry went nowhere. Police officers and detectives also went undercover as dancers at the Barrowland Ballroom in the unlikely event that the suspect would return, but this was not the case, and this line of inquiry also fizzled out. Another line of inquiry, according to the Lost British Serial Killer book, was to check the details of every man between 25 to 35 who had a conviction for indecent assault or rape, as a theory was that perhaps Bible John had met other women at the Barrowland Ballroom and went on to have sex with them, whether it be consensual or forced, as they had not been menstruating. It was possible that he only killed once he found out that the women he had accompanied home were menstruating. However, again, after an extensive investigation into this, the detectives again drew a blank. Following the press conference, where the picture of Bible John was released, and Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie stated that the suspect had repeatedly quoted from the Bible, thousands of leads were generated from the public, who believed that someone they knew was Bible John. Again, upon all of these leads being followed up, they led absolutely nowhere. However, two witnesses who came forward did look promising. A bus driver and conductor reported that they had noticed a man who had matched Jeannie's description getting off their bus in Dumbarton Road in Scotstoun about 1:30 a.m. that morning, before he walked towards the Clyde ferry. They went on to say that this man had been dishevelled, had mud stains on his jacket, and had a bright red mark on his cheek. Despite detectives appealing for anyone else to come forward if they'd seen this man, nobody did. This was possibly the last sighting of Helen's murderer. The taxi driver who had driven Helen, Jeannie, and John home that evening was also traced and questioned, as were the workers on the ferry that a man matching Jeannie's description was seen heading towards. But the taxi driver was unable to add anything, and the ferry workers did not remember seeing a man matching Jeannie's description on the ferry that night. Attempts were also made to try and locate John from Castlemilk, who Jeannie had been dancing with that night, but nobody ever came forward to say this was them. As the months went on and detectives were beginning to run out of leads, in order to keep the story in the public eye, a psychic who had helped police solve murders in the past was brought in by Joe Beattie to see if they could shed any light on who and where Bible John may be. The psychic did apparently claim that the suspect lived in a certain area in Glasgow and that he had a military background, as he held his shoulders back and puffed his chest out. This information had not been released to the public. Detectives began a thorough investigation into the males who lived in the specific area of Glasgow that the psychic had mentioned, but again they drew a blank. According to the BBC documentary The Hunt for Bible John, the police then enlisted the help of a psychiatrist to come up with a possible psychological profile of Bible John before even the FBI had begun their profiling activities. So this was another unprecedented step for the determined Detective Superintendent Joe Beattie. Upon completion of the profile by Dr. Britton, Joe Beattie disclosed the findings to the public, saying that the man they were looking for was possibly a loner, possibly living with a relative, that he is a personable, good-looking man, that he possibly occupies a little authority in society, that he has good social contacts, and they are aware of this man, but that they could be eliminating him as potentially being Bible John due to this man being clean-cut. Some say that this was a risky move by the detective, as if the public were now focusing on Bible John being as described in the profile, then they may ignore the real Bible John because he doesn't fit with the profile. And bearing in mind profiling was still in its very early days, what if the psychiatrist had got it wrong? Whether the profile of Bible John was accurate or not, again, this potential lead led nowhere. And so after many months of more than 100 detectives working on the Bible John murder inquiry, after 50,000 statements were taken, after 5,000 possible suspects had been interviewed, after over 300 identity parades had been carried out, with Jeannie attending each one, after the biggest manhunt Scotland had ever seen had taken place, and after every line of inquiry had been followed up, or had it, and every potential suspect had been questioned, and it had led nowhere, or there had not been enough evidence to move forward, the inquiry into the murder of Patricia Docker, Jemima McDonald, and Helen Puttock went cold and was wound down. And no other murders that could be linked to Bible John happened after Helen Puttock's murder. But the story doesn't end there. Over the years, there have been so many theories about who Bible John could be and why he killed these women, including from family members of the victims. Theories about why the killings had suddenly stopped and why there may have been such a large gap between Patricia's murder and Jemima's murder. There are some who question parts of the Bible John murder investigation and the single-mindedness of the lead detective Joe Beattie. And of course, we've still to discover how John McInnes's body being exhumed in 1996 fits into it all. So join me next time for part 2 to hear all this and more.
Scottish Murders is a production of Cluarantonn.